welcome to Intro to Intuitive Stitching. My name is Erin Holt of eHolt Art, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this art form. We're inspired today by sashiko stitching, which is a Japanese art form that's rooted in practical applications, but also aesthetic. So it's about patching things and making them look nice, but using scrap materials in order to extend the lifespan of fabrics and other usable goods. We're going to focus more on a decorative use of kind of this stitching process, and we're definitely going to do more of just a meditative, artistic twist on it. So without much further ado, let's talk about how we get started. In your kit, you're going to have a tea towel. This is a flour sack style tea towel, and I like to cut mine in half. You don't have to do this, but I just like a slightly smaller towel. So for me, the first thing I do is I fold it in half, find that midway point, take my scissors. I'm just going to do a little snip. And what's cool about woven fabrics is that you can just tear them and get a nice even tear. So I'm going to start pulling, and I'll do the rest off screen, but I will actually pull that into two separate pieces that we can then use in our intuitive stitching process. Now, part of why I like tearing it in half is I have this great opportunity to do a little bit of decoration right along the hem. Everything else in this towel, since it's pre-made, is going to be hemmed, but this seam that we just tore is obviously going to need to be secured. And so I like to start here. Now, you all should have black embroidery floss in your kits. I have a few other colors. You can go out and pick this stuff up for like 99 cents a skein at any arts and crafts supply store. So I'm going to start out with the blue personally, although you can obviously just work with the black that you have in your kit. That will be just fine. I'm going to use a blue thread in order to secure this hem, and I'm going to make sure that stitch is nice and bold. That's why I chose a blue thread. You know, if I wanted it to blend in, I would have chosen a white or a matching thread. But in this case, my stitches are decorative. So I want to make sure that they stand out and they pop a little bit. I'm actually going to first pick a length of thread. So I've undone the skein of embroidery floss, and I'm now going to stretch out a piece, and I'm actually going to make it as long as my arm span, which I can't unfortunately show on camera. I don't have a good setup for that, but that's this finished piece. It's about 5.5 feet long because that's about how long my arm span is. I wouldn't go any longer than that because if you do, it tends to get tangled. Now, if you look at the end, it's a little bit frayed here, and that's just because the skein of embroidery floss, that thread is made of 6 individual strands that are loosely twisted together. And I'm actually going to split those strands, so I'm going to just take 3 of them. I don't need all of them while I'm stitching. That makes a really thick stitch, which is totally fine, but in this case, I'm going to extend the use of my thread. So I'm going to split this thread into 2 halves. And you just want to be nice and methodical about this. I've split the end. Now I'm holding one end in my left hand, and my right hand is kind of fitting in between, and I'm starting to pull and separate. And periodically I have to stop, and I just sort of brush out or kind of run my hand along the end of the thread, and that just relaxes all of the tension that I've put on it in doing this untwisting process. You know, as I move that twist down, it wants to twist tighter and tighter. And so I let go, and I just sort of pet all of my way down the thread to loosen it up, and then I can fit my finger back in there and just keep pulling and separating into 2 equal halves. The best thing you can do is be patient, take your time. If it starts to feel like it's really hard, there's a lot of resistance. Again, just sort of relax, try and loosen up that twist, and you should be able to still go through and split it all as long as you just do it methodically and carefully and take your time. It can be a little finicky, but boy, is it satisfying when you get it split up and you're ready to go. So now I have 2 pieces of thread I can use with. Each is composed of 3 strands, and I'm going to use that to start my hemming. Now I'm going to be using a doll needle or a sculpture needle. I really like this Dritz brand one. It's a nice long needle. It's I think around 3.5 inches. This, by comparison, is the standard sort of sewing needle you'd get in, like, you know, if you had a sewing kit or just a quick patch kit you might pick up from Target. It's much, much smaller. You know, it's for like a single strand of, say, like button thread. You can absolutely sew with these little needles. I just find them too fussy. They're no fun for me. I like a longer needle, I like a sharp needle, and I like one with a larger eye. Please be careful while you're working with it. I don't want you to stab yourself. It is sort of a hazard of the process, but just be cautious. Now, when I'm threading the needle, you can see it's still frayed on the end, and so I need to gather those threads together. And so I'm actually going to use a little bit of water. I actually have a cup of water off screen that I just ran my fingers over with that. You can also lick the end. Just some people don't like that. They find that a little gross. Now it's time to thread the needle, and what you'll notice is I actually just hold my thread very, very still, kind of a short little tail there, and I actually pull the eye of the needle over the end of the thread. I do this instead of threading the needle. I like to needle the thread, so to speak. I find it more stable and a little bit easier. So if you're someone who has trouble with threading a needle, give that a try, see if it works for you. Now I'm going to pull through until I have 2 even ends, and then I'm going to tie a knot in those ends. You don't necessarily have to tie a knot. There are other ways to secure while you're sewing, but just for simplicity's sake, we're going to tie those 2 ends right together right now, and then we're going to trim off the excess, and that will actually make it nice and secure so that we don't have to worry about anything falling apart, which will make this first stitching that we're doing nice and simple. I'm going to trim it back. I'm not going to trim it back all the way to the knot though, because when you do, it tends to fray. So trim it back, and then we're going to get started on sewing. Now, in order to start, what I'm actually going to do is I want to hide that knot. And this is something that you can get real creative about. There's no one way to do it, but as you're sewing, you can sort of think intuitively. It's probably a good one here. Think it through. Think about, how do I make this knot disappear? So what I'm going to do is sew through this little bit of hem we have at the very edge, and then I'm going to fold it over. And I don't mind seeing a bit of the frayed hem on the other side. I think that texture is really nice. You know, that's just something that I enjoy. This is meant to be a fairly kind of rustic stitching process. So I'm just going to fold it over and then sew back through. And what you'll see is I have this nice clean stitch now, and the knot is actually trapped inside in between 2 pieces of fabric. So as I go now, that knot's going to be obscured. No one's going to have to see it. We're just going to see these nice long stitches. Although you can see on my first stitch, I already staggered them. So I don't worry about that. You know, a little bit of human error is fine by me. Although traditionally in this kind of stitch that we're doing, which is called a running stitch, people usually want to try and keep their stitches nice and neat in a long straight line. I don't mind a little bit of funkiness, but if you do notice a little funkiness and you're not happy with it, you can always pull your thread out and just start again. Now I'm doing my first handful of stitches here. Again, it's a running stitch. It's nice and secured at the end. You'll notice I'm not using the embroidery hoop. Since I'm just going all the way down the hem, I'm not going to use that right now. I'm just going to do this by hand. So I'm doing this long running stitch that's going all the way back and forth. And periodically, I'm actually going to use a back stitch. And I'm going to show you an illustration of what that looks like in just a moment here. If we actually look at this drawing, you can see this is the running stitch. It's just going in, out, in, out. You have this illustration in your handout, so you can look at that as much as you want. And if I do a running stitch, every, 10-ish stitches or so, I do a back stitch. And that's where you loop back around and then come right back up. And I'll show how to do that in just a moment. A back stitch is really great when you want to embroider a steady line, because you can end up with a solid line all the way through. But in this case, I'm just using it to secure my stitches. Because when I have a running stitch, if I pull too hard, I can actually bunch up all the stitches because there's nothing kind of keeping everything in place. But if I back stitch, which I will in just a little bit here, if I do that periodically, then that's almost like a stop sign. You know, at that point, the thread can't actually get pulled through, even if I tug really, really hard on the end. So I do mostly running stitches when I'm hemming. I like the way they look. They're nice and simple. It's very traditional in the sashiko style. But I occasionally do a back stitch, which is what I'm about to do here. So you can see I'm coming back through. I'm doing one more stitch. And then what I'm going to do is I am actually going to sew through backwards, just go back a little bit. I'm not going to quite connect with my previous stitch, just because I want the front of this towel to look like it has nice long, even running stitch all the way throughout. So I'm doing a bit of an illusion here. I'm going to sew back just a little bit and come right through the thread in the back there, right out the middle of that stitch. Got it on the first try there. Sometimes it takes a little fishing. I'm going to pull through. And what you'll see is that now if I give it a tug, which I will do in a moment, it won't actually want to gather or bunch up. So I'm going to come back through the front. It'll look like just a really long stitch on the back, so it looks still pretty nice and neat. Unless you're looking closely, most people wouldn't really notice anything amiss with it. And pull all the way through, got a little tangled. And now when I tug on the thread, you can see it doesn't want to bunch up, whereas before it would have completely scrunched up. So yeah, about every 10 stitches or so, I'll do a back stitch just to keep everything in line. And for now, all I'm going to do is finish this hem. And once I'm done, we can get to using the embroidery hoop. If you want to try a slightly different way to do a running stitch, you can actually stack a few stitches on your needle. And what I mean by that is if you look here, I'm actually going in and out, just using taking advantage of the long shaft of this needle. And once I have 4 or 5 on there, I can pull through. It's kind of nifty, can be a bit of a time saver. I actually sort of just enjoy the meditative process of just the in, out of doing a whole long line of running stitches. But yeah, some people like to try it a different way, so I figured I'd show that. Now I've run out of thread. Oh no, what am I going to do? It's fairly straightforward. I'm just going to sew through a couple times in order to finish this thread out. So you can see I'm just sewing through 1/2 of the hem. I'm not going all the way through both layers. This will allow me to sort of hide the fact that I had to add new thread. I'm going to disguise it and hide it back behind there. So I've just pulled through, I think just twice. I'm going to trim that back very close to the stitch so that when the thread over time, the thread will actually sort of disappear. It'll get tugged underneath. And now I'm going to start sewing with a new thread. And I apologize, my hand's in the way, but you'll see in a minute. I'm pulling through a whole new thread, and I now have this tied end. I have this long tail, and we're going to hide that under the hem, just like we did down at the end with the knot. So I'm going to pull through until the knot is right at the edge there. And then I'm going to fold over, making sure I'm fully wrapping around that loose thread. And then all I have to do is keep going as I keep stitching, as long as I make sure that that tail is kind of pushed up towards the edge of that hem. The stitches will hold it in place. It won't fall back out. And yeah, I won't have to see it again. There's no reason you can't trim back that tail and just not have to worry about this much at all. But sometimes I find that getting the scissors out and doing all the trimming sort of breaks my flow. Talking about intuitive stitching, intuitive just means sort of kind of what you think is best, what your brain sort of leads you to, what your just sort of insight is. It's instinctual, really, is a good word for it. And sometimes you'll find that certain parts of the process are less appealing or sort of break your flow, break your thought process. And for me, if I'm going through and trimming all my edges periodically, that kind of throws me out of the moment. When I'm doing intuitive stitching, I consider it a very meditative process. I'm just responding to color, to texture, to pattern. And I'm just trying to work methodically through all of that. And so I tend to find ways to hide my tails or not do knots so that I can really just be sewing and sewing and sewing. We've gotten to the end here, so now I'm just going to be securing my thread. I will start by just sewing through a few times, so I'm just going to go back and forth, in and out. And then I will actually tie a knot in this instance. Now, to be honest, I usually don't tie a knot at the end of a row of stitches. I just do a couple back and forth, and the friction that generates is usually enough to hold the thread in place. But I wanted to show this because I think sometimes, especially when you're first learning how to sew, it can be a little nerve-wracking to get to the end of a line of stitches you've spent a long time on and be like, I don't want this to come out. I don't want to have to do this again. And so I'm actually going to come back through. And the way that I'm going to tie a knot is I am actually going to take the tip of my needle and I'm going to sew underneath this little gathering of stitches I've just done. So I'll show that a couple times just so you can see what I'm talking about, going underneath those stitches right there, going all the way under. And that's going to allow me to loop around those stitches. And then when I pull most of the way through, I'll have a little bit of a loop of thread left. I'm going to push my needle through that so I create a knot. And then when I tug on it very tight, it'll secure it down and it's not going anywhere. That's an extremely secure thread at this point. Now I have to get rid of the tail, and so I'm actually going to bury my thread. And what I mean by that is I'm going to start by, I actually started stitching through that thread, so I'm hiding this last stitch, but then I poked pretty far through. I took advantage of the long shaft of the needle, and I went down about 1.5 inches, and then popped up outside of the hem all the way down there. The last thing I'm going to do is just trim the tail right where it comes out of the fabric, and now that tail is buried, my thread is secure, and I'm ready to go. Now our next step is to use our embroidery hoop. So let's talk a little bit about how an embroidery hoop is made. We have 2 rings that work together. We have our inner hoop, which is a solid piece of bamboo in this case. It can be made out of other materials, but ours are made out of bamboo. You have the outer hoop, and then the outer hoop is joined. It's split at one point, and it's joined using a tightening screw and a little contraption up there. Now, the first thing I got to do is loosen that tightening screw. And there's this little securing nut on the end there. Just don't undo it all the way. That nut will disappear and you'll never get it back again. So we just want to loosen it. The 2 hoops will come free. And I can put the solid hoop, the inner hoop, just flat on my work surface. And then I can lay my fabric over the top. And you can just kind of choose where you want to work on your fabric. Usually when I'm doing these, I don't actually do patching and stitching over the whole material. I'll just choose a section and embellish that, and it becomes the accent. So I kind of usually choose a corner, and I just like this spot. So I put that hoop on there, but I'm actually going to do something extra. I just wanted to show you how that all worked. I'm actually going to put a little extra fabric on top. Now you have a mix of patch fabrics in your kit. And these patch fabrics all come from clothes that I went and bought from thrift stores. I like to go and find silks and cottons and linens. When they're a little worn out, they're a little bit softer. You can usually get interesting colors and patterns that maybe you couldn't find in a fabric store. And you're recycling a little bit too. So it's one of my favorite places to go get patch fabrics from. You all should have some colorful fabrics. I tried to include some yellows, and most of you probably have some reds. There's some grays. Everything's going to be linens, silks, and cottons. And I also definitely made sure to include some blues in everyone's kits. Going back to our sort of source of inspiration here, which is sashiko. Sashiko is traditionally done using white thread on a blue indigo dyed cotton or linen. And so I just wanted to make sure, as a nod to our source material, where we kind of got our inspiration from, we had some blue fabric available. You can always go through and just look at your own, if you have a fabric stash, pull some patches out of that you like, or look at your clothing. Do you have a piece that you just don't wear anymore? It's a nice pattern, but it doesn't fit. Just be bold, go grab it, start tearing it into pieces, and using that patch fabric, you can start creating these beautiful, intuitively stitched designs. Now I'm going to start on my first bit of sewing here. You can see I've pulled through. I've got this nice little tail. I'm going to tuck that under. I did not put a knot in this one. I don't need to, actually. Intuitive can mean instinctual. It also can be just mean, working with the knowledge that you have, working with the what you know. And so in this case, I know that friction will stop things from moving. It holds things in place. So I'm actually just going to use a few stitches. I'm going to pull them nice and snug that wrap around that tail. That friction, that grab is going to hold onto that tail, and these stitches will not come free. So I'm just using logic. I'm using the knowledge that I have, the skills that I have, to just kind of freestyle. And you can see I've got that one secured there. And then when we flipped over to the other side, you'll see me keep going, and I'm just going to follow the line of that tail, going all over that tail, and securing it in place. You can look at this illustration of what the stitch is that I'm doing. This is called a whip stitch. Oftentimes whip stitches are actually done around the side of a fabric. You can use it as a real quick way to do some joins or to finish a hem. But in this case, we are using the whip stitch just decoratively. You can see, if you saw in that illustration, there was a dotted line. That was what was going behind the fabric, and there was a straight line, and that's what was going in front. And you can have the diagonal line. You're going to end up with a diagonal and a straight line, and you get to choose which one you want to be on the front or the back. In this case, I had the diagonal go on the back, and I'm using these straight stitches on the front, and I'm following the line of that tail because I can just see it under this piece of silk that I'm using. I thought it kind of had a nice organic wiggle to it. It's a little bit curved, a little bit angled, and I thought that would be a nice guide for me. When I'm doing these intuitive stitching projects, I don't want to think too hard. I'm really just trying to respond to what am I feeling? What is my instinct telling me? What am I getting excited about? What colors make me go, oh my gosh, this is gorgeous. I got to keep going. What textures are like, oh, this feels really cool. I want to keep doing this. In this case, I just saw the way that tail laid down, and I thought that's really cool. I'm going to follow that. It's a nice organic line, and I'm just going to use it as my path, as my trail. It's going to tell me where to go. Once I finish this one line of stitches, I'm going to check on the back, and I usually do this periodically when I'm embroidering to make sure my back looks nice and neat. It's pretty easy to end up with kind of gunked up stitches that tangle, or stitches that kind of crisscross. In this case, my only issue is that I switched direction at one point. You can see the first two stitches are going one way, and the rest of the stitches are going the other. That doesn't bother me at all. It's just part of the process. So I'm going to move over now, though, and I'm going to add in another line of stitches. And I'm just going to keep doing this, put a few lines of these whip stitches down, and I will we'll just watch that for a moment, and then I will come back and talk about the next stitch when we're ready to go on to that. All right, I've finally run out of that blue thread, so I'm going to switch to this black thread because I know that's what we all have in our kits. So I'm going to do this next stitch using that. But I take a moment always, I do a lot of sort of just touching and feeling, and I just enjoy the tactile nature of this art. So I take a moment to just kind of pet the stitches that I've done, get a feel for them, just enjoy the process. Now I'm going to start with my next line of stitches, and I'm just going to do a running stitch, or actually I might call this in case basting stitch or a basting stitch. I actually can never remember how that one's pronounced. It's basting, but a basting stitch or a basting stitch. And that's just a really, really long running stitch, essentially. So you can see I actually sewed underneath the fabric, and I have a nice long tail there. I'm actually going to leave that tail. This is, again, a very textural, instinctual, kind of go with the flow sort of process. And as I was sewing, I just liked it. I thought the tail hanging out added a nice little touch. It was a little fun. And so I've decided to leave that there. Now, from a practicality standpoint, it might not be the most practical. I may end up ultimately trimming it back later. But for now, I just thought it looked nice, so I figured I'd hang on to it. Now with this next row of stitches, I'm actually doing these nice long, again, basting or basting stitches that go all the way around in a circle. In this case, I'm using the embroidery hoop as a guide. I'm letting that embroidery hoop guide me all the way around the circle. So I'm basically letting my needle kind of hit up against the hard edge of the embroidery hoop. That's what's giving me an indication that I'm going in the right spot. And I'm just sewing all the way along, creating a nice circular pattern. You can actually buy embroidery hoops in different shapes, and sometimes I use them as a sort of like a stencil is a good way to think about it. I can use them and move them in such a way that it allows me to create nice even designs and even shapes without me having to stress or make any sort of sketch marks on the surface. All right, I've gone all the way around with my stitches. You can see I did mostly a circle, but when I came down towards the end, I decided to just do a nice long line of big chunky stitches that follow the straight line on that patch. And traditionally, when you look at this in a sashiko sense, these long stitches, you would put layers of them next to each other and line them up, and it actually created a reinforcement. It wasn't just to join patches together, so you got a hole in your fabric, you got to patch it so that it's a solid piece of fabric again. They also found that if you did these nice long lines of stitches, you'd create these reinforcing bits that would hold it all together a little bit more snugly. In this case, as I've already said, this is more of a decorative aesthetic project that we're doing. But I do notice as I'm going how much stronger and firmer the fabric goes as I'm sewing. This is a very, I've already said it, but I'm going to say it again. This is a very tactile, a very kind of like touch and like feeling oriented project. And so take some time if you're going to be approaching this from a meditative sort of contemplative standpoint. Give yourself some time to just sort of notice these things as you work on them. That will also help to build your intuition, so to speak. The more you sort of pay attention and notice and think about, how is this working? Is it actually, what kind of effect is it having? Those skills and knowledge will build over time. And so every project you work on, you're bringing just a slightly larger pool of knowledge, a bigger set of resources with you to that project. I think sewing sometimes can get really intimidating because we feel like we have to rely on a pattern or a project, or we have to do drafting. And those things can be fun, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it's nice to approach sewing and stitching and working with fibers in a very free-form fashion. So that's everything that I'm doing here is unplanned. I'm working on it as I go. I'm getting a feel for it as I go. Right now I was looking at this yellow fabric and I had a little bit of this silver gray thread, and I thought that'll contrast really nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and do some star stitches here. You can see I buried my tail and I started doing a nice long stitch. I'm going to cross it with another stitch here. And then I can stop here if I wanted, but I actually really like to then go right through the middle, and I'm going to do 2 little tiny securing stitches. That's going to hold down the center. It also makes the center just a little bit thicker, so you have this slightly elevated texture. It changes the feel, it changes the security, the stitch doesn't move around quite so much, and I just like the way that it looks. So I'm going to go through and do a handful of star stitches, and you know what? At that point, I'm going to be just about done with this project. So let's take a look at some of these details. We've got those star stitches. You can see I actually trimmed a bit of that fabric back and then I frayed the edge just to give it some texture. You can see I did a few more stitches here too. I've got these golden stitches. I did some nice long lines of running stitches. You can see I've got some arrow stitches actually going on in the other area there, the right just to the left there. And as always, I'm going through and I'm spending some time really petting and touching and feeling everything. The only section I don't really like on the back is the star stitch section because the stitches kind of jump all over the place. If I was really stressed about it, I could always just take a piece of patch fabric and just do a series of running stitches that would then, look nice on the other side and then disguise that on the back. The rest of my stitches, I'm quite happy with it. Even this long one there that I had to secure in a couple funky ways, it all looks fairly tidy, so it's working for me. It's all up to you. It depends on what you like, what your aesthetics are. But definitely take a chance to admire and appreciate your work. This is, I think, a good chance to sort of experiment, try new things, and then what you like, what you're happy with it, celebrate it, be joyful, take a picture of it, share it on Instagram, share it with me. I'm on Instagram at eholtart. I would love to see the work that you do. And I hope that this process is fun and interesting and engaging, and I hope that it helps you develop your own intuitive stitching practice that you can do on your own in the future. So that's it. Thank you so much for sewing with me, and I really hope we get a chance to make some more art together in the future.